Hey, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I guess a global pandemic has put a stop to that. But I'm there with you in spirit and delighted to be speaking. So I'm going to talk to you about innovation in healthcare. We're going to talk about three main topics. What is innovation? Why should you innovate? And what do you do if you've got a good idea? And we all have good ideas. So let's go straight in. So the first question is, what is innovation? So if you look at the dictionary definition, it's the act of introducing something new. But is that always correct? This is a picture we all know of penicillium, 1928, the second floor St Mary's Hospital. Or is it? In fact, penicillium was first described by John Tyndall, a physicist, in 1928, 50 years before Fleming had seen the same image, but had not made that quite right association. And so innovation is not necessarily something new. Take Stelios Hagianou or Michael Ryan that developed low-cost airlines, which we all know as EasyJet and Ryanair. So popular, obviously it's taken over the front cover of Time magazine, but in fact that magazine is not from the 80s and 90s when they came around. That magazine is from 1960 in fact, 62, when Freddie Laker had developed exactly the same business model, the original low-cost airline. The problem with the Laker Airlines, it was the wrong time, and in fact, it went bust. And so it paved the way for what later happened and became a global sensation, if you like. So it's about timing, it's about execution, maybe, but it's not necessarily about something new. It's also not necessarily about something better. There's nothing in that definition that says an innovation has to be better than something that we had before. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind. Now, we're in the midst of this COVID pandemic, and obviously that's had a dramatic effect on all of our lives. We're developing vaccines quicker than we've ever done before. We're spending more time with the family. We're inventing and innovating. We're developing, if you like, new ways of using technology, and all of us are adapting and embracing technology. Just like this recording allows me to give you a talk from the hospital. Forgive me for being in my pajamas. But actually, even the COVID issue, even viruses aren't new. Back in the 60s, this is an example of an iron lung that was used to treat polio. And the problem was affected your muscles and you couldn't breathe, and so you required a ventilator or an iron lung in this situation. And if you're an entrepreneur, you'd look at that and think, wow, I could build a hospital with 50 of these iron lungs, and that's exactly what happened. But even then, something can come along and just pull the wool from under the floor. Okay, and no one could have predicted at that time that the Salk and in fact Sabin would have developed vaccines that have eradicated polio. And I think the important point there is that innovations can get have a time and a place and can get disrupted or removed. And the second thing is that nothing's new. Okay, the Sabin and Salk fight, which is worth reading about, in fact, echoes or mirrors some of the fights that are going on at the moment between Pfizer and AstraZeneca. The next concept I want to talk to you about is disruptive technology. This is Clayton Christensen. Okay, he's a professor at Harvard who effectively looked at innovations and said some innovations are iterative. That means they're just polishing something that was done before. And then every now and then you get a disruptive technology that changes the way we do things. I suppose in healthcare, an MRI would do something like that. The classic one we think of is the iPod. Okay, we used to carry around Walkmans and listen to them. If you've seen Guardian of the Galaxy, those Sony Walkmans, and we used to listen to tapes with music fixed onto a device, and you share the tapes with someone else. Until the iPod came along and just said all music's now going to be stored on a hardware device that's going to be stored in your pocket. And that then paved the way for numerous iterative innovations, including the iPhone and the Apple Watch. In healthcare, I suppose hip replacements was pretty much a disruptive technology because it changed us doing things, for example, fusing hips or cutting out the hip, or living with the pain, and suddenly being able to give people a new lease of life. But since that time, there's been hundreds and literally hundreds of new hip replacements that are all just a slight change, a slight modification, slight change in shape, a bit more polishing, if you like. And those are iterative innovations. Okay. It's important to understand how innovation's adopted. Okay, so Everett Rogers is a professor of sociology from Iowa, and he produced a very nice bell-shaped curve which demonstrated how innovation happens. And initially, you get the sort of first movers and shakers, the innovators, and the early adopters onto the technology. You know if you're one of those. The laggards come on much, much later. They're the people that resist and resist and resist. Many of the publishers resisted and resisted and resisted technology until it bit them on the heel and they had to change their business model. If you then look at a chart of adoption along that graph, then what typically happens is you get a spike, an initial rise in the curve, if you like, when the early adopters and early majority come in. And when it hits the peak, then you suddenly get something that looks like it's coming to market. But it takes the late majority or the laggards to come on board before it plateaus and becomes effectively a way of life. Okay. And this, when it's up here on the flat side of the curve, the plateau, then that means it's been adopted. Okay, now at any point on that curve, it could crash and burn. Okay, now let's look at a graph like this. What I suppose let's find an example that demonstrates a crash and burn. Well, back in the 70s and early 80s, there were two technologies that we used to do. I guess most people here will be too young for that, but we used to listen to television and then record things. For the first time, you could record them on a videotape. And that was a complete game changer for people in the 80s. And there were two formats. One was the VHS, made by JVC. It was big and cumbersome. And then Sony came along with a much sexier, smaller technology that, in fact, could record for longer, called the Betacam. But actually, this was a great example of a fight to the death, and only one could succeed. And in fact, it was JVC that won out that war, and Sony's Betacam died a few years later, largely because the early majority and early adopters pushed the curve towards JVC. Very clever marketing and very clever positioning and partnerships. So that's a great example of adoption and death of innovations. Now, in healthcare, things are slightly different. I'm going to cite an example of why things are different. Okay, now everyone knows this man. This is Steve Jobs, sadly passed away, in fact, of cancer 10 years ago. But what he did was he innovated more than anyone else in the technology space in changing the way we embrace the way things design, the way they look, the way they feel, the way they behave, and brought that to technology. Okay, now one of his biggest innovations is the iPhone. And the thing is you develop an iPhone, and the early majority, the early innovators, love it and they want to try it, and they accept that it's got some flaws to it. But when those flaws come to the fruition, then they just bring out the iPhone 2. And when that has failures and flaws, they bring out the iPhone 3. And then really by the time you've got iPhone 8, it's a global sensation, and millions, if not billions, of devices are sold. That's different than healthcare. Okay, now in healthcare, if you bring out a new technology or a new device or a new way of doing things and it doesn't work, someone may die. Okay, and so the stakes are much, much higher. And that's perhaps explains the difference between other fields and healthcare. And in healthcare, you've got significantly more regulation and more steps to prove that something has effect. And for a drug or pharma and certain technologies nowadays, with the new device regulations, you have to initially develop your idea, prototype it. Then you've got to do preclinical studies, maybe even then move into randomized control studies. Then you actually get the thing to market, and then you've got a post-market surveillance for years on end. And so, and all of this process was done in less than a year for the COVID vaccines, but normally that process takes years and years and years and is very, very expensive. The cost of developing just one drug target, for example, is in excess of $1 billion. So, next question. Why should you innovate? Okay, now there are multiple reasons. Maybe you want to provide better patient care, improve the way you do things. It's possibly you want a more stimulating life than the day in, day out. You want to make money. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you're honest to yourself that that's what you want to do. It's perhaps self-satisfaction with what you do, or recognition. You want someone at last to say, he did that and he achieved it. You want to get that recognition. And it may be that you want to contribute to society, give something back, and be a change merchant. And in fact, for many of us, it's all of the above as your reasons. Now, if you're qualified now and you do things every day, you treat patients, then you know, really, by the time you retire, 25 years from now, your contribution is finite. It's whatever you do on a daily basis, multiplied by the number of days you do it, and that's it. That's your contribution. You could retire right now and you know that's the contribution I've made to life. And you can change the fulcrum of that relationship, for example, by working in a multidisciplinary team or running a courses, training juniors, running fellowships. And that shifts the fulcrum to the right and increases your healthcare effect that you're having on other people. But if you develop a new drug, device, or technology, you multiply your contribution by the power of X. And only Banting and Best and the likes could really sort of imagine how, Fleming and all these people that have completely disrupted healthcare can imagine how much their contribution has done, much more than any of us can do on a daily basis. And that's why it's important to invent and innovate. Before I go to this, I just want to show you why I'm playing this video. So um, I'm going to play a video that I think highlights the innovation process that many of us go through. Okay, we wake up in the morning with a great idea. So here's a video for you.
I always wondered why nobody did it before me. I mean, all those comic books, movies, TV shows. You'd think that one eccentric loner would have made himself a costume. I mean, is everyday life really so exciting? Are schools and offices so thrilling that I'm the only one who ever fantasized about this? Come on, be honest with yourself. At some point in our lives, we all wanted to be a superhero.
Why did I play you that video? Well, for some of you who are falling asleep, it was to wake you up. But there was a real reason, which is that we wake up with an exciting idea and we think, why has no one done this before? And you spend hours thinking about it, drawing it, doing some research. And then you realize that it's actually a lot harder. It's not as easy. And it's not that every idea crashes, that's not to say that, but it is a lot harder. And so before you go off to think about developing your idea, remember that the time and effort that you're going to be spending on this is huge, but the rewards are just as huge. Okay, so I want to give you a few tips of what you can do if you've got your idea and you're thinking, well, what do I do next? Well, of course, the first and most foremost important thing is there something original or new about your idea? And that's not necessarily the be all and end all, because sometimes you just take something, as I showed you before, that has been done before and you just do it better. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you are going to try and develop an idea, having an original idea is not only hard, but also kind of important. And I'll explain why in a second. Obviously, to get from the wheel, then there's been numerous iterations, but there's no point reinventing the wheel, as they say. Okay, and to have patentability or to be protectable, then you have to have something that's new and enabling. Okay, and I'll explain what that is. So, to protect your idea is not worth anything. Okay, so if you have an idea right now, don't think that it's worth a single penny. It's not worth anything. It's only worth something if you have some form of intellectual property. And there are lots of forms of intellectual property you could have. There's know-how. That means don't tell anyone, it sticks in your head. For example, a formula for Pepsi Cola or Coca-Cola, that's know-how that no one else knows. It's top secret. On the other hand, you can protect things. You can protect them with design rights. And if it's a drawing, you can protect them with something known as a patent. And what a patent is, it's a legal document that allows you to tell your idea to the world in return for a period of time of protection, perhaps 25 years. Okay, and in those 20 or 25 years, you have disclosed all of the idea and how to do it, but you're protected in law from someone else from copying you. And here's an example, if you like, of a crock that someone else has infringed. That was a design right rather than a patent itself. But to be patentable, it has to be new, but it also has to be having an inventive step and be enableable, which means that you can't just say, I'm going to go to the moon and I'm patenting that. You have to be able to show how you do it, what materials you'd use, how you make the rocket, and all of those things are the enablement, if you like. If it, that it's the term is industrial manufacturable. So in other words, that you can manufacture and make it. Now, there is a reason I say this actually about protecting your idea is that I said to you before that your idea is worthless because it's not worth anything. Once you've got a patent, then it's tangible. It's like having bricks and mortar. Okay, so you can have an idea for a fantastic house, the best architect's design of a house ever, but unless you own the land registry or if you own the bricks and mortar, then it's not really worth anything. And vice versa, a patent is a tangible thing that you can sell or exchange. It's not actually just having a patent itself isn't going to make you money, but it's going to be something that's tangible that you could either sell or prevent someone else from doing what you're doing. In other words, it's enforceable. So if you've got an idea, then what are your options? Well, I suppose the first and foremost thing that I'd recommend that you do is you sit down and decide who you are and why you're doing it, along the terms of the list I gave you before. Yeah, are you doing it for one of these reasons? And I think it's really important that you do this because if you, for example, tick that you want to make money and you then try and become uh, president of the Royal College of Physicians, for example, then you're conflicted and people will criticize you because you're just trying to make money. If, on the other hand, you do want to become the president of the Royal College of Surgeons and what have you, then you may structure it slightly differently so that you could still make money, but that you're not perceived as being a commercial animal. And I think it's really important right now at the beginning of your yellow brick road that you sit down and say, right, what do I want to achieve out of it? And what is my steps and my route to getting to where I want to get to? In other words, reverse engineering of how you're going to get there. And I think this is probably the most important point that I can say to you. Sit down right now, work out who you are and why you're doing it. And I say that because you have to work out whether you're an entrepreneur or what I term an ideapreneur. Okay, and ideapreneurs are people that come up with an idea and they really are passionate about those ideas until the next day they wake up with another idea. And then they forget about the first idea and they've got a better idea. And some of us are serial ideapreneurs and we keep inventing new ideas, but we never execute any of them. If you're an ideapreneur, your route to market is very different than if you're an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is all about having resources. It's understanding how to get the resources, how to raise money, how to put a team around you, how to coalesce all the forces that are necessary in order for you to develop your idea. But we're not all entrepreneurs. Only a tiny proportion of people in the world are entrepreneurs. And if you're not an entrepreneur, then don't try and become one because you will end up and enter into agreements and relationships that aren't necessarily aligned with your goals that we ticked on before. So I tell you, if you're an ideapreneur, the most important thing that you can do is sit down and surround yourself with people who are different than you. And our tendency is to say, I'm going to find like-minded people, people that believe the same as me, that do the same as me, bring them together and we're going to form a team. No, oh, wrong, mistake. Okay, what you have to do is surround yourself with someone that's boring, an accountant, someone that's challenging, someone that's absolutely passionate and sort of anal about getting things right, someone that's got legal expertise, someone that's got design and creativity, and someone that's articulate and that's a clever marketeer. Those people, if you have them around you, people can knock down doors and sell things. Those are the people that you want around you because those are the skills that you don't have. And if you surround yourself with people that can develop and expand on your idea, then you're so much more powerful than the sum of the individual parts. And the challenge is, and this is something that we all do, is we surround ourselves with the wrong people. And so if you're an ideapreneur, surround yourself with the right people, people that are different than you. If you're an entrepreneur, go for it. Okay, people say to me, should I hang up my white coat and go for it? Absolutely. You're going to make a huge leverage and a huge influence on the world if you believe in it and you've got the vision and the drive and the determination to take it forward. Just to give you a few examples of some people that have succeeded and the routes that they took. So Gary Mickelson was funny enough, an orthopedic surgeon, and I'm going to give you orthopedic examples. I've got loads of examples, but I'm going to give you some orthopedic ones because they're close to my heart. But Gary was a huge 6'7", sort of massive, huge guy, and he had huge hands. And spinal surgery, as you know, is through a small hole in the back, and so he couldn't get his hands into the spine, and so he invented loads of ways of being able to do spinal surgery through a small hole remotely. And he filed patents, and he had hundreds of patents. And really, Gary wasn't an entrepreneur, but what he was able to do was to leverage the value in his patents. And what he did was develop patents, develop ideas, and create some intellectual capital, some intellectual property. He then sold those ideas to Medtronic for a sum somewhere in the region of $1.4 billion. Okay, and then he can set off and do everything that he wants to do in life with no restrictions, largely because he focused on what he was good at. A contra-example is the chap in the middle there, who's Maurice Ferreira. And Maurice was also an orthopedic surgeon. Well, in fact, he was a junior doctor who then gave up because he had a dream and a vision to go and run a business. And what his business was a robot that was going to be able to put in knee replacements, and a very clever business model that was known as a razor blade model, which you basically give a robot away and then you sell people the implants, just like Gillette do with the razor blades. And he created a company called Mako Surgical, and this is me and Maurice and another friend, John Dougal, back in maybe 10 years ago. And what's interesting there is uh, Maurice was he left medicine because he was an incredible salesman. He was articulate. He was a driver. He made things happen. A real entrepreneur. And what Maurice did was focus. And he took Mako not into a huge company. It wasn't huge, but he managed to sell it to a huge company because they could see the opportunity. What big companies don't do is innovate very well. And so there's a real opportunity for you guys who are creative and can develop and innovate to sell your ideas to big companies who will take them on. And if you go down the company route, the exits again can be fantastic. So Mako was sold to Stryker about 5 years ago for about $1.65 billion. Okay, a huge success, a huge exit. Again, he can go on and do anything that he wants in life, having been that successful. And many of the philanthropic things that he does now only came about because he put that effort in earlier on. But not all ideas are commercial. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of something that we sponsored, which I just loved this idea. And this was Jeanette Hines in the bottom left here. And Jeanette was a physiotherapist and also a professional footballer. And what she found was that she was working in the NHS and in mental health services in East London, so a very deprived area of the country. Lots of patients with mental health issues were going in and out of hospital. Care in the community was sort of coming around, but it didn't really exist. It was a bit of a fallacy, and so patients were coming in and out of hospital, and sometimes they go into hospital because in the hospital Jeanette was there playing football with them, and she worked out that basically playing football created an environment where these guys suddenly had to adhere to rules. They had teamsmanship, friendship, and they were getting fit and active. And so there were a whole bunch of benefits that she realized. And so she came up with the idea of creating something called PMA, or positive mental attitude football. And the idea there was to create a league, and lots of people with mental health problems in the community could join a football team and benefit from the service that she developed. And when we first met her, then her idea was fledgling, but the idea then was to turn it into a charitable enterprise, call it the PMA Foundation, and that then looked at sport to help all form of mental illnesses. So virtually every sport was fair game, I think, apart from darts, which wasn't such a good idea. But it was a beautiful idea, beautifully executed, and something that's going to change the world, but not necessarily make any money. And so there are three types of idea I think of: the idea that you're going to form a company and go off and build a business. Most of the time, you won't create the next Google because not many businesses in healthcare do that. That's because the big players tend to buy you out somewhere along your journey. Or you develop some intellectual property and you license it, or you sell the patents. And that is a nice, neat way for you to leverage your ideas. Or you become a social enterprise and you go off and you change the world, and you develop a new treatment for malaria, or in this case, mental health services. And all of them will bring back huge returns to you and to many others, but you've got to decide what you want to get out of it. And people ask me, what should I say to an investor if I want to get money? Money is not the be all and end all, you know. I mean, this is Sir James Black, who is a Nobel laureate who's changed the world like no other. I mean, Sir James had developed beta blockers, and after he developed beta blockers, he came up with his next idea. Um, and at the time, working for ICL, his second idea wasn't considered to be very successful. In fact, it was a new target for this treatment of people that had stomach ulcers. And at the time, surgery was taking off, and the business guys, the guys with the checkbooks, said this isn't really going to make a lot of money, but it is Sir James, and he has developed beta blockers, so we're going to allow him to develop the next one. And weirdly enough, his H2 antagonist, which he developed, became within a year bigger sellers than even the beta blockers, and were game changers. I think the important point, and this is a quote that he said to me before he died, and has stuck with me all along. Okay, and something I think is probably the most powerful quote I can say to you, and I'll do it in my most awful Scottish accent. We all get obsessed by all the time with making money. He goes, but you have to start somewhere. And if you make something and it works, it'll make money. Apologies for anyone that's listening there with a Scottish accent for my awful attempts. But this is one of the most powerful quotes you'll ever hear, because stop focusing about money, stop focusing about going to persuade others of your fantasticness of your idea. And you don't always need money. What you do need to do is to prove that something works. Okay, and we call that in the industry an MVP, or minimal viable product. Okay, so focus on being able to prove to someone else that it works. Now, sometimes that's a benchtop prototype. In the case, for example, of Jeff Bezos for Amazon, it wasn't a website called Amazon. It was the notion that someone would buy something through this new medium called online. And so when he began, it was Amazon Books. It wasn't Amazon as we know it now. It was Amazon Books. And all he did was he put a website up and said, buy a book, and he put a catalogue of books on there. He didn't even have the books. There was no warehouse. There was no cataloguing system. When someone made an order online, he went to a shop, purchased the book, posted it, packaged it himself, and sent it off to the individuals. And that is how you begin. His MVP was to show that people would buy something through the internet. It wasn't about building a big factory. And I think you've got to work out where your MVP is. And for technology companies, sometimes it's easier than it is for devices or drugs. But don't forget this quote. Guys, I hope that you have enjoyed this talk, and that I'd love to take some questions now, and spend some time with you through the power of social media and the internet. My name is Andy Goldberg. Please don't hesitate to direct message me or get in contact through any means possible. Love to hear from you. I'm working 24/7. I'd love to hear your ideas.